Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you for coming to our program this evening. I'm pleased to welcome our guest, Dr. Larry Blomstedt from Galveston College, and he teaches also part-time at Texas A&M in Galveston. So he's one of these folks who serves two masters, plus all of the students as well. Larry got his education. He got his PhD in history from Texas A&M University. He got his Master of Science in History and Politics from Texas A&M University at Kingsville, and he got his Bachelor of Science in Chemistry at Texas State University. We may have to ask him how a chemist became a historian. He's here this evening basically because his new book, Truman, Congress, and Korea, The Politics of America's First Undeclared War, was published less than a year ago. And copies of the book are out there for you to purchase if you'd like, and he will sign them after this event is over. I'd be happy to do that. He's had many other publications, numerous articles, presentations, book reviews, and conference papers. He's even served as a reviewer, I believe, for the Missouri Press on books they might like to publish. So he's kind of kin to us in Missouri through that experience as well. He has taught at Texas A&M University at Galveston as a lecturer, as I indicated, Galveston College, where he's an associate professor of history, and he's a program coordinator in history and government. He's also taught at Santa Jacinta College, Texas A&M University as an adjunct, Lone Star College as an adjunct, and Blinn College as a history instructor. He's had considerable community service experience, as I said, University of Missouri Press. He's a member of the Historic Record Society of Galveston County, and if you read his resume, you'll notice he's had several awards for his scholarship. May I present to you Professor Blomstedt.
Thank you, Dale. Appreciate that. It's really an honor to be here with you all this evening, and I've sure enjoyed the lovely Kansas City weather here. It's a lot more hot and humid down in Galveston on the coast there, so it's been a delightful time here. So thank you all for inviting me. I want to begin and just tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book, and essentially most of the book is it's a political history, and it's sort of a pulling together, a synthesis, as we call it in history. I want to kind of pull everything and have a comprehensive political history of how President Truman and Congress dealt with the Korean War. In addition, there's one chapter of original research in the book that I'm going to talk about. But tonight I'm going to focus on a couple of chapters. But before that, again, why did I write the book to start with here? Well, one of the things from my experience just as a student is I always felt that the Korean War was sort of overshadowed by Vietnam on the one hand and World War II on the other. And so I was interested in that for that reason. On a personal note, my father came this close to having to serve in Korea. He was in the Army and was very close to shipping out over there when the armistice was signed, and then he didn't have to go. And so I was always kind of curious about that. And also when I took my first college history course in the early 1970s, the modern U.S. history ended at World War II, and so I always sort of wondered what happened next. And so it's due to all of these things that I kind of got interested in the topic. And as I learned more about Truman's presidency, I was awestruck by how many foreign policy crises he had to deal with in his first 5 or 6 years in office. I mean, starting with the decision to use nuclear weapons on Japan, the crisis in Greece and Turkey that yielded the Truman Doctrine, the Berlin airlift, the decision to recognize Israel, going forward with the Marshall Plan, this huge expenditure to rebuild Western Europe, and then Korea. And so I thought, I think it was an amazing time that he was president to have to deal with all these things here. So that's kind of why I got interested in all of this. And so tonight I'm going to talk about 2 chapters in the book. I'm going to first begin and talk about the chapter that discusses Truman's decision to go to war in Korea and analyze that, and especially all of this in the atmosphere of McCarthyism, which the Korean War and McCarthyism sort of engulfed the country at the same time. So the first part of my talk is going to be based on that, and then The last part, I am going to talk about the chapter of original research, which has to do with congressional peace initiatives during the war that really no one else had researched, and I found kind of interesting. So that's kind of what I'm going to share with y'all tonight. So let me begin and just kind of review a blow-by-blow of Truman's decision to intervene in Korea. Truman had flown home to Independence from Washington for the weekend, and it was a Saturday in late June of 1950. That night, around 11:20 p.m., he got a call from his Secretary of State, who was Dean Acheson, to tell him about the North Korean invasion of the South. And so by the next day, Truman decided it was such an urgent situation that he needed to go home and return to Washington. The president was in such a hurry that he gets on the plane, and so he's waiting for the plane to take off, and he asked the pilot, what in the heck are you waiting for? And he says, well, I'm waiting for my navigator, and the president said, leave him here, we need to get going. And so they literally pull up the gangplank and shut the door, and as the plane is wheeling to taxi up the runway, here comes the navigator in a car. They literally had to throw down a rope ladder for the guy. Now, I doubt that the plane was going very fast, unless you really wanted to build the story up here. But it shows, I think, kind of some of the urgency behind the president's mindset as he was heading back to Washington. Truman decided to intervene immediately, just about to the surprise of just about everyone. And again, I think what had a lot to do with that is the context of the times. And this was June of 1950, but 1949 had been a really tough year for the president in terms of foreign policy. First of all, the Soviet Union got their first nuclear weapon and had their first successful nuclear test, and I think it was August or September of 1949. Now, the big surprise wasn't that the Russians got the bomb. The American intelligence figured they were going to get it, but they got it 3 years earlier than expected, okay? They were saying, well, the Russians are going to have nuclear capability in 1952, 1953. Now it's 1949. And within a month of that happening, Mao Zedong and the communists won the civil war in China that had been restarted after World War II ended. And so this was a traumatic event for the nation that a country the size of China has now fallen to communism. And so that's in the summer and fall of 1949. It's in the following February that Senator Joseph McCarthy launches himself to national prominence with his famous radio address from in which he had his explanation for why in the world all this could happen. He said the only explanation for the Russians getting the bomb early and for China, for the communists to win the civil war in China, was that we must have a State Department that's riddled with communist sympathizers. And he said, I have a list of 205 names of people working in the State Department who are, have communist ties. And then over the next few weeks, the more he talked about, the more the numbers changed and so forth here. But my point here is that starting, in February or so of 1950, President Truman is absolutely getting hammered by the political opposition, not only from Republicans, but also conservative Democrats in his own party, mostly from the South, who are kind of jumping on the McCarthy bandwagon and pounding him for being soft on communism here. So with that, Truman does decide to intervene. And now why did he make this decision? Well, I argue that there's probably two reasons behind this. I think perhaps the most important reason is that he felt like he had to draw a line in the sand to stop Joseph Stalin. In Truman's mind, he pretty much equated Stalin with Adolf Hitler. And to me, looking back here, there's a little bit of difference there. I think that Hitler was truly bent on world domination. Stalin was a little bit more crafty and subtle and really wanted more to stick it to the United States than to take over the world. And so Truman was certainly convinced that Stalin ordered this attack. Now, after the Cold War ended, we learned that it didn't actually come down exactly that way. It wasn't Stalin that ordered the attack. It was actually initiated by North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung, but he certainly got the green light from Stalin to do this. But of course, Truman didn't know this at the time, and he certainly believed that Joseph Stalin ordered this attack, and that this, and equally important, that this was just going to be the first of many future attacks by the Soviet Union in various places in the world here. And so in Truman's mind, he's thinking 1938, the appeasement of Hitler at Munich, right, when Hitler was given the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise not to take over the rest of Czechoslovakia. And of course, we all know what happened with that promise. What did Hitler do 6 months later? Invades Czechoslovakia, right? And so Truman saw this as simply a replay of that and decided, okay, this is where I'm going to draw my a line in the sand. In fact, during decision week, the first week when the United States decided to go into Korea, Truman told a group of lawmakers, quote, "If we let Korea down, the Soviets will keep right on going and swallow up one piece of Asia after another." And then he later said, and then probably the Middle East and Europe too here. So to me, it's pretty clear this is the main reason Truman decided to intervene. But there was also a secondary reason, and that had to do with the United Nations. Truman believed that the future of the United Nations was at stake. That Sunday night, the invasion occurs Saturday. He flies back to Washington that Sunday. At his first meeting with his national security team, they kind of took a break from their discussions, and a couple of witnesses there said they saw Truman standing over by himself and kind of saying to himself, "We can't let the UN down. We can't let the UN down." And so that was certainly a part of his thinking. Later that week, he mentioned publicly his regret that the U.S. had not joined the League of Nations, after World War I, and that the U.S. had kind of dropped the ball there. So a secondary reason is that Truman felt like the UN's credibility was at stake. Now, having said all that, there is no doubt in my mind either that Truman would have gone it alone even if the UN had not endorsed a military action. And there's two pieces of evidence to support this. One is that as Truman was getting ready to get on his plane and fly back to Washington, his personal physician told a reporter, let me get the quote here, he said, "The boss is going to hit those fellows hard." Okay? And also, Truman's daughter, Margaret, wrote in her diary, she had spent at least part of that weekend with her dad. She wrote that day, quote, "Northern or communist North Korea is marching in on Southern Korea, and we are going to fight." Okay, so this was all before any action had been taken by the UN. So I believe Truman would have acted unilaterally if necessary. Fortunately, that was not the case, and it did become a UN action there. So to kind of continue on the blow-by-blow of events. So as Truman gets back to Washington that Sunday night, he authorizes air and naval support for the South Korea capital of Seoul for the evacuation of Americans there. Monday, by early afternoon, he gets news that the government in Seoul is fleeing from the North Korean onslaught. By that evening, Douglas MacArthur, who is still over in Japan overseeing the rebuilding of Japan, reports that South Korea's collapse is imminent. Therefore, by Monday night, Truman expanded the mission of the Navy and Air Force to assist South Korea as needed below the 38th parallel, which was the dividing line between the two Koreas. And very significantly, Truman ordered the 7th Fleet to position themselves between mainland China and the island of Formosa, which we call Taiwan today. And of course, the reason there is that due to the Chinese Civil War, the former government of China, the nationalists, had fled, kind of formed a government in exile in Taiwan, and Truman didn't want the Korean War to expand and get China involved here, so he sent the 7th Fleet up there to separate the nationalists and the Chinese communists, just in case there. As their evening meeting breaks up that Monday, Truman tells an attendee, quote, "Now it's time to call their bluff." And again, he's talking about Stalin here. Now that Tuesday was the first time Truman met with members of Congress, and he simply informed them about a press release that was going out explaining the actions he had taken Sunday and Monday. And it was then that the UN Security Council did call for the withdrawal of North Korea and for member nations to assist South Korea. Now keep in mind here, the only reason the UN Security Council acted here was that the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council. Now remember, the Soviet Union is one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, and they therefore have absolute veto power. But they were not there to veto this. Why? Because they were protesting the refusal of the UN to seat Mao Zedong's government as the official representative of China. And so that was the key reason that enabled the UN to take military action here in Korea. So getting back to my timeline. So Tuesday, Truman fills in his congressional leaders for the first time. Wednesday, Congress acted very decisively. They passed an extension of the Selective Service Act and gave the President the power to expand it as needed by the hefty margins of 315 to 4 in the House, 76 to nothing in the Senate. Now, the interesting thing about this is that 2 days earlier, this bill was hopelessly bogged down in Congress, that there's no way this is going to happen, and then suddenly, miraculously, it passes. It's amazing what an invasion will do, to unloose legislative gridlock there. That Thursday, Truman has his first press conference, and this is one that will come back to haunt him, because in the question answer about Korea, he picks a couple of unfortunate terms to describe it. He talks about this as a bandit raid and then as a police action. Well, as the war turned sour for the UN, these words would really come back to haunt Truman, because when you think of a bandit raid, does anybody really think about tanks and bombers and that sort of thing and tens of thousands of troops? No, that doesn't sound like much like a bandit raid or a police action. And so these are just an unfortunate choice of words that will cause the president plenty of grief later on in the war. So that's Thursday. Now Friday is when everything kind of comes to a head that first week. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Truman gets a request from General MacArthur for a combat regiment right now, plus 2 divisions for a counteroffensive. Now, of course, a regiment is roughly 1 to 2,000 troops. A division is typically 10 to 15,000 troops. So MacArthur says, I need a regiment right now, 2 divisions after the fact. Well, on the spot, Truman approves a regiment right there. And so he says, I want to talk to the Joint Chiefs of Staff before I talk about your other requests here. And so he meets with the Joint Chiefs later that morning and approves them. So with that, we've got a major combat operation approved by the President of the United States without any congressional input. And so he makes a press release, and so again, the U.S. is in a ground war. And as one congressman wrote after they found out about this, and this is kind of a powerful quote, he said, all of us were shocked by the realization that only 5 years after World War II, American youth were once more involved in military combat. So that really conveys, I think, the shock and dismay. World War II is just over with, and now here we go again. So that's a little bit of the blow-by-blow of how everything happened. Now I want to get into this notion of congressional approval. How did that process work? Did Congress, was there any effort made to get congressional approval and all that? And I found all this very interesting. So the thing to keep in mind is that at the time, there was very little outcry from, hey, wait, we're supposed to be the ones declaring war here, not the president. I mean, there's practically nothing from Congress. And in fact, Monday of that first week of Decision Week, as I'll call it, Truman asked a key member of Congress, Senator Tom Connally of Texas, who happened to be the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, kind of an important dude, in foreign policy. He asked Connally if he thought that he, the president, should get congressional approval. Connally told him no. He said, no, you don't need congressional approval. And here was his very interesting analogy. He said, quote, if a burglar breaks into your house, you can shoot him without going down to the police station and getting permission. Well, that all kind of sounds good, but a burglar breaking into your house is not quite analogous to a major military operation with tens of thousands of troops. And also, you could certainly argue, was the North Korean invasion creating an urgent security issue for people in the United States of America right then and there, and it's kind of hard to argue that, although many members of Congress said, well, this is just the first of what's going to be a bunch of similar adventures from Joseph Stalin here. So anyway, Senator Connally tells President, no, you don't need congressional approval here. Now, probably the most notable exception to Congress's silence on this issue was from Robert A. Taft. Now, he was the de facto leader of the Republican Party in the Senate. He wasn't the minority leader, but he was pretty much the Republican with the most prestige there. Well, around midweek, he did get up and give a speech on the floor of the Senate, and he said that Truman had exceeded his constitutional authority. Even before he submitted or committed ground troops, he said Truman exceeded his authority when he sent the Navy and the Air Force over there to assist with the evacuation of Seoul. And he said, if this goes unchallenged, he said the president could, quote, go to war in Malaya or Indonesia or Iran or South America without congressional consent, end quote. And he warned that if Congress didn't respond, they would, quote, terminate for all time the right of Congress to declare war as provided in the Constitution. Another thing that Taft correctly brought up was a piece of legislation that Congress had passed in 1945 called the UN Participation Act. And the purpose of this law was to reconcile the United States participation in the UN with U.S. law here, okay? And essentially, the UNPA said that before the United States could commit troops for UN usage, that had to be approved by guess who? By Congress as well here. And so Taft makes what I think was kind of a cogent argument that congressional approval needs to happen here. Now, after saying all this, Taft said, I support the intervention in Korea completely. And so he wasn't quarreling with Truman's action. He was worried about the legality of it and the precedent that was being submitted there. And so he sat down and immediately Senate Majority Leader, the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress at this time, Majority Leader Scott Lucas of Illinois got up and he blasted Taft and said he didn't know what he was talking about, and he rattled off precedents about Thomas Jefferson and the Barbary War in the early 19th century and the Boxer Rebellion, which were much smaller, conflicts than what was going on in Korea. And so that was really the only, the most significant bit of resistance from Congress. Now there was one other one, and that was that Friday. Truman did have a closed-door meeting with 16 top congressional leaders, and he was challenged there by Senator Kenneth Wherry of Nebraska. Now, Wherry was the minority leader in the Senate, and he and Truman did not get along at all. In fact, Truman referred to him as the wooden-headed undertaker from Nebraska. And Wherry had been an undertaker by living, but yeah, he didn't like Wherry at all. And so they're in this meeting of 16 people, and so Truman went around the room and asked for their feedback about, what to do in Korea here. And Wherry stands up, as if he's on the floor of, the Roman amphitheater or something, and makes this big production again about getting congressional approval. And he says, you're telling us after the fact, and the way this is supposed to work is that you're supposed to get congressional approval beforehand. And when Wherry challenged this, Truman made kind of a confusing response. And here's how Truman answered why didn't you get congressional approval? Well, first of all, Truman said, well, he couldn't confer with Congress because it was an emergency situation. And Truman said, quote, I just had to act as commander-in-chief, and I did. This is typical. Truman was a decisive fellow, right? But then he said, if things escalate or if things get more serious, then I will advise Congress. And I didn't say I'll consult or ask permission. He says, I will advise Congress. So it's a very confusing response to me, because on one hand he's saying, well, I didn't get congressional approval because it was an emergency, but if things get even worse, then I'll maybe consult you after the fact here. And so that's kind of where that ended. Now, even more perplexing to me is the following Monday. Okay, so this is July the 3rd now, okay? This was the only time that there was a specific meeting held to specifically discuss this issue. Actually, it was two issues. One, should should Truman get congressional approval for the war? And 2, should he make some sort of an address to a joint session of Congress about this? And so that was the purpose of the meeting. So actually, it was called by Secretary Atchison. Forgive me, got that wrong. It was Secretary Atchison that called the meeting. And so the attendees were Truman, Atchison, the cabinet secretaries, the military service secretaries, and then what we call the Big Four congressional leaders from the Democrat side in Congress. And these were Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn, Majority Leader John McCormick, Vice President Alvin Bartley as the chair of the Senate, and then Senate Majority Leader Scott Lucas, who I mentioned a while ago. Now, the problem with this meeting, which I thought was hugely important, at least looking back on it, is of these Big Four congressional leaders, only one of them bothered to show up, and that was Scott Lucas. The other 3 wanted to start their 4th of July vacations earlier, and so Rayburn and McCormick and Barkley didn't even attend the meeting, which in retrospect, is really troublesome, I think, here. And so literally Truman went around the room and said, okay, what do you think I should do about this? And when I read this, and these were from Secretary Atchison's notes here, I was amazed at how poorly most of the people in there served the president, because none of them would come out and give their opinion on anything. They'd say, well, on the one hand, you could do this, Mr. President. On the other hand, you could do this. And they just all, and even Speaker Rayburn, who's, glorified in my home state of Texas, as, being right next to God, right? But even Rayburn said, well, I need to consult with members of the House and so forth here. And so nobody would really come out and tell the president what they thought here. And so what was, I think, particularly crucial, and this wasn't Senator Lucas's complete fault because he was the only member of Congress who bothered to show up for the meeting here, but when it came Lucas's turn to talk, he really gave a response that was absolutely all over the map. And I want to share a little bit of this with you. First of all, he told Truman, that he had, quote, very properly done what he had to do without consulting Congress. So Lucas says, oh, that's all right, you don't need to consult Congress. And so he said, I oppose a congressional resolution. But he said the proposed draft, I think Secretary Atchison had drafted up something for consideration. He said it was satisfactory and it would pass easily. So he's saying on one time, well, you don't need a resolution, but this is good and it would pass quite easily. And then he contradicts himself further. He says that many of his colleagues were saying that Truman should, quote, keep away from Congress and avoid debate, unquote, and worried that the debate would take a week or longer, and said many members were sick of Senator Taft and Senator Ware's attitudes. And to me, this doesn't make a lick of sense, because on one hand, okay, if everybody's, if there's no resolution needed and if everybody's going to vote for the thing, why are they worried about floor debate? Or if everybody's opposed to, or most people are opposed to Taft and Ware, what's the problem with the debate? And then Lucas concluded his remarks and again reiterated, well, if you submit this resolution, it's going to pass unanimously. So then what is the fear about all of the debate? Now, another thing that Lucas mentioned is that he opposed Truman making an address to a joint session of Congress because that would, quote, be practically asking for a declaration of war. Now, I'll make an aside here. There's no way that Truman would have ever asked for a declaration of war, because from the very beginning of the Korean conflict, he was determined to keep it a regional war. I mean, as determined as he was to draw his line in the sand against Stalin, he was equally determined not to let World War III begin there. And so again, I think this was a crucial meeting. This was the last time this issue was discussed in any meaningful way. And so that was that. Now, after the meeting, a Republican senator, he was a moderate Republican named Alexander Wylie of Wisconsin, and he was on the Foreign Relations Committee. He kind of got to thinking about it after the fact and tried to push hard behind the scenes. He had conversations with Truman and his committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, and got nowhere. But Wylie wrote something very interesting about this, and he said, quote, no single military action taken by the executive branch has had as many widespread implications as this one. And of course, what he's saying is that this is going to be the first of many military, what they believe were military confrontations with Joseph Stalin and the Soviets elsewhere. In another interesting comment, one of Truman's top aides, a fellow named George Elsey, later concluded that Truman had been dreadfully wrong not to get congressional approval. And he put some of the blame on himself. He said, quote, "We of the staff have served him poorly by not seeking congressional involvement in the opening days of the conflict. It was soon too late. We had Truman's War to deal with." See, so now, because Congress wasn't on board, when the war turned south, whose fault is this? That dadgum President Truman's war here. So that's how the discussions that unfolded to regarding congressional approval, which did not happen. Now, how did the nation respond to Truman's decision to intervene? Well, he was a national hero for a couple of weeks. Newsweek magazine said the nation was revived by Harry S. Truman's immediate counterpunch. Other magazines talked about virtual unanimous approval, 99-1 in favor in the nation. Even the leader of the Socialist Party in the United States, Norman Thomas, and Henry Wallace, Truman's political nemesis, they bucked their parties and supported the intervention. And believe it or not, the Carnegie Foundation for International Peace endorsed the Korean War. So you get the idea that people are on board for the Korean War. Yes, indeed, they were. So, and members of Congress, I got to throw a couple of, members of Congress get kind of excited in these situations. And there was in the euphoria here of the decision to go to war here, a representative from Indiana, John Walsh, a Democrat, declared that the U.S., quote, "will deluge Russia itself with atomic bombs. It won't just be a one-bomb attack either. We have at least 250 bombs, so we're going to drop 250 nuclear weapons on Russia." And to be fair, I got to throw in a Republican here as well. Charles Eaton, a Republican from New Jersey and an ordained Baptist minister, said, quote, "We've got a rattlesnake by the tail, and the sooner we pound its damn head in, the better." Now, he didn't say that with his Texas drawl that I have, but that's what I'm kind of afflicted with here. So the nation is very gung-ho about Korea at the very beginning. So, to discuss a few questions about all this. First of all, one of the things I wondered about as I kind of digested all this was, okay, what was the role of McCarthyism in all this? Remember, as I said earlier, Truman is in the midst of being accused and pounded for being soft on communism. So one thing I wondered about, well, did McCarthyism bully Truman into starting this war? And on the pro side, you could make the argument that perhaps it did, because one of the things that the war did was make Truman reverse his course regarding the Chinese nationalist government on Taiwan. He had pretty much written them off and said, well, they lost to the communists, and that due to corruption in their regime and so forth, and there's nothing we could do for them. And now suddenly, what does he do? He sent the 7th Fleet up there to protect them from the communists. And so suddenly, Taiwan has become a priority, a defense priority for the United States that it wasn't beforehand. So, you could possibly make that argument that, yeah, McCarthyism had a role there, but I don't think so. I mean, and that's just my opinion. And the reason for that is that I don't think Truman really reacted to the pressure on this particular issue. I mean, Truman had resisted pressure in the past regarding cutting off aid to the nationalists in the Chinese Civil War, and later, of course, Truman did the unthinkable and fired General MacArthur, and so I just don't think that that Truman was motivated by just, well, I better do this, or I'm going to be hammered by Joseph McCarthy. I think Truman was motivated as much of anything, as I mentioned, by this feeling like this is 1938, this is appeasement all over, and also the nature of the attack. I mean, this wasn't just some little guerrilla thing that escalated. This was a massive, full-scale invasion with Soviet weaponry being used by the North Koreans and all that stuff. And so I think that's why he intervenes. Now, the other big question, okay, was this legal? Okay, I was yammering on and on about congressional approval here. So was this legal? Well, this is kind of complicated here. So let me kind of walk you through this as I discussed in the book there. The question is, well, how was this supposed to work regarding the UN and U.S. troop deployments? In the United Nations Charter, Article 43 addresses this. And so the way this is supposed to work is that before the fact, before there's any need for force to be used by the UN Security Council is tasked with hammering out what they call special agreements with member nations to use some of their military resources. And so the way it's supposed to work then is that the Security Council negotiates with each country, and each country says, okay, well, we'll dedicate a division of soldiers, or we'll give you so many planes and so forth, and this will be at UN disposal in case it's needed for peacekeeping reasons. So that's the way it works in the UN Charter. Now, the linkage there with American law was this UN Participation Act that Senator Taft brought up. And in the UN Participation Act, it authorized the president to negotiate these special agreements with the UN Security Council, subject to approval by guess which body? Congress, right? Okay. And so that's the way it was supposed to work. Now, in 1947, 3 years before the war, before Korea started, the Security Council of the UN had tried to do these special agreements. Guess what? Nothing ever happened. That's because of Cold War tensions, right? No one could agree on who's given troops to the UN for what. And so when the Korean situation unfolded, in a sense, Truman and Congress were in uncharted waters because there was no special agreement for Congress to approve. Okay, this was all supposed to have been worked out ahead of time, Congress to have approved it, and then so if the UN voted for military action, they could go for it and use American resources here. So, getting back to the legality argument, on one hand, and there have been scholars that have argued this, that said, well, Truman did not break the law because there was no special agreement for Congress to approve. And so you can make that argument. However, I have a problem with that argument personally because clearly the spirit of the UN Participation Act called for congressional approval to commit American troops for UN usage. And to me, what kind of seals the deal here is that who in America was in office when the UN Participation Act was passed in 1945? Guess who was President of the United States? Harry Truman. Guess who was? He was Undersecretary of State at the time, Dean Acheson. And a bunch of the members of Congress were there. Let me get my numbers here. Yeah. Let me find up here. Yeah. 2/3 of the Senate in 1950 had voted on the UN Participation Act. 256 out of 435 House members had been there to vote on it. So, and this was only 5 years previously. So, to me, Congress and the President knew darn well that congressional approval was supposed to happen here. So, and again, it also underscores to me, why didn't Congress raise more fuss about this other than Senators Taft and Wylie? You know, most of them were there back in 1945, but I guess they forgot. I don't know. So technically, I would argue that no, the president's action was not legal. Now, another question that I addressed in the book was, okay, was why not? Why didn't Truman get congressional approval here? Well, it's interesting here. The president himself and Secretary Acheson gave what I think were contradicting reasons. When the Secretary of the Army, a guy named Frank Pace, asked Truman about this, well, you're going to get congressional approval. Here's what Truman said. He said, Frank, it's not necessary. They're all with me. So I don't need approval. They all agree. Okay. Doesn't that just sound like Truman? Right. Yeah. And yet, when the same question was asked of Secretary Acheson, he said he wanted to avoid a floor debate. He didn't want to have to answer ponderous questions that would muddy up our policy. And of course, as I was whining about a while ago, Senator Lucas didn't give Truman much helpful feedback as well here. So to me, what's the question about this? Well, here I think maybe McCarthyism came into play here because Truman was going to intervene in Korea and was not going to let McCarthyism stop that. But he also, I think, was afraid that that a floor debate in Congress was going to give his Republican opposition some more chances to beat on him. And so it's hard to say exactly why, but that's kind of my take on it, is that he wanted to avoid floor debate because he simply didn't want to give the McCarthyites an opportunity to beat on him. Now, a big point I make in the book is that a Congress, and especially Truman's leaders from his own party, have to shoulder a lot of blame here. I mean, both Senator Connally and Senator Lucas told Truman, you don't need a congressional approval here. And I think the big lesson here is that congressional leaders from a president's party can and should kind of be a rudder to help presidents, remember whether they're stepping over the line and that sort of thing. Now, yet another question that scholars have raised here is that, okay, and we historians, we love to Monday morning quarterback, right? That's kind of what we do. But we've talked about, okay, if Truman had gotten Congress's approval, would this have helped Truman politically later down the road? Because as y'all probably know, the Korean War made Truman an extremely unpopular president. He had some of the lowest approval ratings in American history, if not the lowest, at the time he left office. So the question is, well, maybe if he'd have gotten Congress on board, that would have saved him a little bit politically. Maybe he could have run for another term as president in 52. I don't think so, and the reason for that is that Congress had sort of reneged on him on a couple of occasions during the war, and I think they easily could have done it again here. And the example I discuss in the chapter is that early in the war, and especially I think it's around the time when, shortly before China entered the war, Congress granted Truman emergency war powers like wage and price controls and that sort of thing, and gave Truman a lot broader powers than he really wanted at the time, and he barely used a lot of these powers until later. Now later, as the war turned sour and China got in, Truman tried to exercise some of these powers, and Congress turned the tables on him and pulled back the reins. And in 1952, Truman attempted to nationalize the steel industry in the country and Congress, and ultimately the Supreme Court said no to that. So my point is that I'm not sure congressional approval would have helped Truman politically. They changed their mind on mobilization and said, yes, we're giving the president a bunch of power. Oh, no, we're not going to give him that. We changed our minds here. I think they very well could have done that. Yeah?
Why did they want to nationalize the steel industry?
It had to do with steel prices, and it was actually a labor dispute. It was because of the mobilization that the government had a bureaucratic organization to negotiate like wages and so forth, and the steel companies and labor were butting heads, and Truman was siding with the laborers, with the unions, and so when the steel mine owners, or the steel mill owners, I should say, refused, then he threatened to step in and nationalize it. So, yeah. Well, see, yeah, that's the argument he was using here, is that because they're going, because the union kept delaying going on strike and so forth, and so that was the argument Truman used, but it was actually struck down by the Supreme Court. Yeah. But great question. Something I found very ironic when I was reading up on all this stuff is that as Truman was discussing this one time, he was asked by one of his aides about this congressional resolution for war. He snapped, quote, "It was none of Congress's business. I just did what was in my power." And yet, not long after that, he told another staffer, and listen to this quote. He said, quote, "I sit and shiver at the thought of what could happen with some demagogue in this office I hold." Now, isn't that interesting? Okay. And so to me, with that second quote, the president articulated perfectly why it's a good idea to get Congress on board, is that because you never know when there's going to be some demagogue in office that's going to just want to do what the heck they want, and I think that's what separates American government from that of other systems there. So So what about the legacy of all this? How has this mattered here in U.S. history? Well, it certainly influenced, I think, Lyndon Johnson to get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution in Vietnam. Remember, Johnson was in the Senate at the time, and he saw what happened. And so and of course, Johnson, some people would question the legality of this, but he used the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to send 500,000 combat troops to Vietnam. And since the Korean War, most major troop deployments, defining major as over 1,000 troops, most of these have had some sort of congressional approval. Now, we haven't had a declaration of war since World War II, but the four exceptions are certainly the major wars like Vietnam and the Gulf War and the Iraq War of 2003. There have been congressional, resolutions approving the action. Now, there have been four exceptions that I've found since the Korean War. I thought it'd be fun to just share these with you. In 1962, John F. Kennedy sent 5,000 troops to Thailand, but he had them back home in 3 months, so it was kind of a quick and dirty thing. One that was not so quick and dirty was when President Nixon secretly expanded the Vietnam War into Laos and Cambodia, and Nixon brought those back after American people took to the streets and protested. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush sent 2,000 troops down to Panama to get the dictator Manuel Noriega. He was smart enough, I guess. I wonder if this was by accident, but he did this while Congress was out on Christmas recess, and he had them back home. They were very efficient, and he had them back home by February before Congress was back from Christmas recess. And then the one that was probably the most complicated, and I read a little bit on it, and I just got a headache and gave up and quit. But between 1994 and 2000, with President Clinton in the situation in Bosnia and Kosovo, by the time it was over with, and I didn't really realize this as I was preparing for this talk, he had sent some 25,000 troops over there. Congress passed resolution after resolution about, well, we think we should just use bombing or ground troops and all this kind of stuff, and there's so many I couldn't even keep up with them. So this was, I'm not sure that was bona fide congressional approval, so that was kind of in a gray area there. So to me, Truman's error, I guess you could call it, of not getting congressional approval has largely, I think, been heeded by future presidents for the most part, because there have been over 50 deployments of American troops abroad there. So what I want to do now is, in our last few minutes here, is talk about another chapter in the book, and that's about congressional peacekeeping attempts. And again, this is new research, and I just sort of stumbled across it and thought I'd write a chapter about it. And so there were a couple of peace initiatives thrown out by Congress before the armistice talks started. Now, remember, the Korean War armistice talks started right at a year after the war began. So these were initiatives before the two sides sat down and started talking. The first of these was by Representative Al Gore of Tennessee. Now, he's the daddy of the Al Gore that ran for president here in 2000. Representative Gore said, I've got the plan here. Let's plant radioactive waste along the 38th parallel. And all you need is about a pound of radioactive waste for every 10 square miles. Is that? Yeah, for every square mile. Okay, so you need a pound of radioactive waste per square mile. The Army told him, we've got plenty of it available, Mr. Gore, if we want to do that. And then they would do radio transmissions to warn soldiers if they tried to cross the demilitarized zone that they would face a certain death or slow deformity. That ought to be enough to scare you off right now. This was actually probably borrowed from an idea from General MacArthur. He was toying with the idea of using this technique to separate the Chinese from their supplies in Manchuria, the Chinese province of Manchuria. Truman ignored this suggestion. Another one, this is really weird. Senator Ernest McFarland, and he's the guy that became majority leader in 1951. Scott Lucas got beat in the midterm elections of 1950. And so McFarland, who's from Arizona, is the new, actually minority leader because Democrats lost control of the Senate. he plans an interview with Cosmopolitan magazine. That's right, Cosmopolitan magazine. And why he would use an interview with Cosmopolitan for this, but he had this plan for world peace, which presumably would include Korea. And there were some other legislators that were going to be interviewed as well, but he was proposing to end the arms race with the Soviets by offering to permanently disarm Japan and Germany. Okay, Secretary Acheson got very alarmed when he heard about this, and he intervened and he persuaded McFarland, don't say that when they interview you, and so that was that. Now, a more significant one was proposed by a Colorado senator named Edwin Johnson. He was a Democrat. And Johnson had a much more specific proposal. He suggested having a ceasefire on the first anniversary of the war's start, and that both sides should retreat to their side of the 38th parallel, that all non-Koreans should leave the peninsula, and that they should arrange an exchange of POWs by the end of the year. Johnson's proposal was initially ignored in the American press, but not so in the Soviet Union. Pravda, which was the media organ of the Soviet Union, made a big deal about this, said that the U.S. is beginning to realize that Wall Street's gamble in Korea is hopeless. The British press started running with it, and they said that Johnson's proposal has gotten the attention of the Indian ambassador, and India was pushing this now in the UN. And then an American journalist, Stuart Alsop, who Truman detested. He called him one of the Sop sisters. You know, there was the two brothers that were journalists. Alsop wrote a column and thought this was going to be feasible as well. Now, what I found interesting is, again, Johnson's making this proposal in the atmosphere of McCarthyism. And so you would think that would make him vulnerable, because if you make a peace proposal and the communist newspaper likes it, what are you going to get branded as, you know? And yet there was really I was unable to find any, criticism or anything from McCarthy or any of his minions there. And Johnson didn't back down. He said, well, I still stand behind my plan. Now, in the end here, Johnson's plan didn't really amount to much. India had already been pushing for peace well before he came up with this proposal. I've not run across any thing in the post-Cold War archives that indicated that anybody high up in the Soviet Union paid any attention to what this was. All it did was kind of create a headache for Truman in terms of diplomatic issues and so forth. Now there were two more, and both of these came to fruition after the armistice talks started. And the first of these was something called the McMahon Ribicoff Friendship Resolution. Brian McMahon, a senator from Connecticut, was the guy who kind of started this. And he started early in 1951, but we didn't get it formalized until after the armistice talks started here. Senator McMahon was kind of an unlikely source, in my opinion, for a peace resolution. He was the co-chairman of the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy, liked to call himself Mr. Atom, and once called the bombing of Hiroshima, quote, the greatest event in world history since the birth of Jesus Christ. Okay? How's that for an extreme statement, right? And so he is making a peace initiative here. And so he got his Connecticut colleague in the House, Abraham Ribicoff, to co-sponsor it. But what the idea here was to send a message of friendship to the Russian people, and to McMahon, damage control needed to be done, because what had been going on earlier in some of the communist nations is that they had been marshaling an anti-nuclear kind of movement here, and they had a big meeting in Stockholm, Sweden, I think in 1950 or earlier in 1951 maybe. And so these communist countries had really gotten people on board. They had 288 million signatures on a petition to end nuclear weapons worldwide. And so that was an eighth of the world's population at the time. And so McMahon thought that the United States needed to mount a counteroffensive against this so-called, this anti-nuke movement that had kind of started to gather momentum there in Stockholm. And so essentially the message was that to assure the world that Americans were not warmongers, that it regretted the barriers between the Soviet and the American people. It urged free exchange of information between countries. It blamed the communists, of course, for hindering world peace. But most important, it challenged the Soviet leadership to share this statement with their citizens. Now, McMahon also wanted to include an invitation for Joseph Stalin to visit the United States, and Truman nixed that. He said, forget it, we're not inviting that guy to the United States here. But they did submit this resolution. Truman wrote a little cover letter to kind of give his buy-in there. And so about a month later, sure enough, the Russians did kind of issue a rebuttal, but they did release this letter to their people. It was the first time the Russian people had heard a message from the United States since World War II. Now, of course, in the Soviet rebuttal, they responded with a litany of offenses that America had done against them, and they proposed a 5-nation conference to discuss nuclear disarmament. The U.S. had already stated its opposition to that, saying that's what the United Nations is for these sorts of things. But the Soviets did respond and did release it to their people. When President Truman got word of this from an aide, he took a quick look at it, tossed it back at his aide and said, bunkum. I kind of think he said something other than bunkum, but I have a feeling they kind of edited that. And Truman never made an official response and sort of let the ball drop there. One last one, and then I'll conclude and take some questions here, is a Vermont senator named Ralph Flanders made a peace proposal toward the end of the war. Flanders, who Secretary Atchison referred to as a peppery little man from Vermont, took a very moral approach here. And he got up on the Senate and he made a speech, and the title of the speech was, "Let's Try God." How's that for an attention getter, right? And this was sort of in the spirit of the McMahon resolution, but he told his colleagues that they needed to heed Christ's call to love their neighbor as themselves and apply that to the Russian people. Said that the U.S., if it was going to be successful in Korea, needed to adhere to the moral laws of the universe. And then he got down to business. He proposed a demilitarized zone anywhere from 50 to 100 miles wide along the Yalu River, which is what separated North Korea from China. And he said this DMZ will be permanently policed by Asian members of the UN. No white or capitalist nations could be involved in policing the DMZ. That the UN would commit to rebuilding both Koreas within 3 years, and to have reunification elections for the Korean Peninsula after the second year of that building process. Now, the positives of Flanders' proposal was that he was paying attention to Chinese sensitivity to their power plants along the Yalu River. That's what helped get MacArthur fired, is when he bombed some of those power plants. And the communists worry about their port cities of Vladivostok and Racine, and he also was willing to take the risk of letting the Koreans elect a communist regime, because he was confident that if they saw the fruits of the UN rebuilding their country, that they would vote in a non-communist regime here. And as he was pitching this, Flanders made a couple of really interesting statements that kind of hit home to us today. First of all, he said that in the Korean War that the UN had practically ruined the people we set out to save, and that was fairly accurate. And then he predicted, he says, if we don't do something to end this war, and now listen to this, 2 hostile armed forces will continue to face each other for an indefinite period. And here we are in 2016, and what have we got over in the Koreas? Now, the problem with Flanders' proposal is that he probably underestimated the communists' unwillingness to risk losing the whole peninsula. But maybe even more important, he ignored the POW repatriation issue. The sticking point of the peace negotiations had been what to do with POWs, because Truman wanted to give communist POWs an option not to have to be sent back home, and the Chinese were insisting on all POWs go back to their homeland. And so Flanders' proposal really didn't address that. So, having said all that, you might say, well, we've wasted all our time here, because did any of these congressional proposals end the war? No, they didn't, okay? But why not? I think it's instructive to think about that. Well, first of all of these were sort of lone wolf plans that were thrown out by individual members of Congress. None of them had committees or coalitions. None of them had any clout on the Foreign Relations Committee. None of them really had President Truman's ear, or any influence with him. And so I think that's the main reason why they didn't fail. But interestingly, none of these guys were attacked by Senator McCarthy for trying to end the war peaceably, And so one of the things I argue in the book is that maybe the effect of McCarthyism has been overrated a little bit in history. And there's plenty of folks that would disagree with me on that. All of these guys that made these peace proposals were up for re-election in 1952, and they all won. So there apparently wasn't any risk for them doing this. And I think it also underscores the difficulties that Congress has in trying to influence foreign policy. So that's all I have to say about that. I am happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
We had, I'm going to guess, 1,000 advisors on the ground in the Korean Military Advisory Group. Do you think that the fact that we had troops in harm's way from day one made Truman's decision a little bit easier?
I would say,
palatable?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that certainly could have factored in. I mean, again, I think he was very preoccupied about Stalin and so forth, but certainly that could well have factored in. Of course, one of the big issues in Korea is that we had demobilized so much, and some have criticized Truman. Well, you invited the attack, but yet Congress had voted down an aid bill for Korea just a few months beforehand. So, but point well taken. Yeah.
Could you compare and contrast the accuracy of information that the Congress and the President and the American people as a whole had during the Korean era with what they had in the Gulf of Tonkin era?
In terms of what kind of information? Right.
Well, it seems to me that some of the information relating to Gulf of Tonkin was clearly not accurate, and based on that, there were a lot of things that happened afterwards.
Gotcha now, yeah. Well, first of all, from what I know about the Tonkin resolution is that there's even been some question about, it was launched because of the small gunboat attack, right, in the Gulf of Tonkin, and there was even some doubt. One of the ship captains wasn't even sure if they had, been attacked because the gunboat that attacked them was so small. But the big thing with Tonkin, I think, is the way it was worded. The Tonkin resolution was, well, to protect, American interests and aggression and so forth. And did that really, when members of Congress voted for that, did they really think they were voting for 500,000 troops going into Vietnam? And so I think a lot of the problem with that was that exactly what did the Tonkin resolution mean? What did Johnson intend? Because after the fact, a lot of members of Congress said, "Oh, I didn't know I was voting for that. I didn't know I was voting for major, ground troop deployments there." So I think that may have factored in.
I was very surprised to hear that you said that the United States had bombed the power plants in China, because I knew we've been very careful when we took out the bridges between China and Korea to only bomb the Korean side, so not appear as an attack on China. How did China respond to our taking out the power plants?
Well, I think that's part of the reason they got into the war. Now, but having said that, I need to backtrack a little bit, because we now know after the Cold War ended that as soon as UN forces crossed the 38th parallel, the Chinese decided right then to get in. And what they did, they waited for MacArthur to extend his supply lines. And in that interregnum is when the bombing around the Yalu River occurred here. And of course, MacArthur never believed that China would enter the war, and indeed they did in a very big way with several 100,000 troops. But we now know, we didn't know this until after the Cold War ended, but we now know that Mao Zedong had decided to invade as soon as they crossed the 38th parallel. And to me, the tragedy of this is that because of what happened in the Chinese Civil War, the United States and Communist China did not have diplomatic relations. You know, we refused to recognize China as a country until Nixon went to China in whatever it was, 1972, yeah, something like that. And so China and the United States had no diplomatic conduit. Everything was having to be routed through India. India was one of the countries that tried to be genuinely neutral during the Cold War. And so the Indians were talking to Mao's government, and they told the British, who told the U.S. that hey, the Chinese they're upset about this and they're going to invade, and Truman administration said, sort of blew that off and said, well, you know, you can't trust those Indians, you know, because they're neutral in the Cold War, you know, and we wanted everybody to choose sides in the Cold War. So that's one of the tragedies. If there had been some mechanism for some dialogue, maybe, you know, that could have turned out differently, and certainly would have changed the nature, maybe shortened the war. Who knows? Yes, sir. You had a question? Yeah.
Yes. It seems like there was really a lack of preparation, or maybe a lack of intelligence at the beginning of the invasion. So I guess America anticipates North Korea to invade so quickly. So, so if you keep that in mind, then maybe Truman's actions, in terms of immediately deciding without consulting the Congress, is justifiable, at least on a short-term basis, because if the issue was to be debated, and if that lasted a long time, it would have been too late, and there would have been a de facto occupation of South Korea. So,
yeah, I mean, the North Koreans came really close to just taking the whole peninsula there, you know, and so, I mean, if Congress, I really think, due to the universal approval by Congress, I guess I would like to think that they wouldn't have debated it as long as maybe Truman feared, but I mean, it happened quickly, you know, and that's a big reason Kim Il-sung was able to convince Stalin to give him the green light. He said, man, I can have this thing mopped up, and even, the Americans aren't going to get in, and even if they do, it'll be too late. And I mean, the UN initially just barely hung on to that little, around Busan, which is a little port city on the southeast corner of South Korea. They established a little perimeter about 50, 100 miles around there, and so Grenada was you know, a done deal. But yeah, I mean, Truman may have, you know, want to be decisive and be in a hurry about it. So that's a point well taken.
We have time for one more question.
One more, okay. Yes, sir. I saw you first.
Just from memory, I think Truman was dealing with a particularly hostile Congress, and I think it had to do with some kind of corruption cleanup he was doing in Congress before all this happened.
That's going to come into play a little bit later in the war, and I'll talk about that in the book as well. That's not going to really start making the news till 51 and 52, and that's really going to that and along with the war is going to hurt his chances for re-election. But yeah, he was getting you know, hammered for that as well. But that came into play in a very big way later in 1951 or so.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.